So you might be aware that there are sub-workflows in n8n. You actually don't need to use them in your workflows, but if you use them and use them well, you can really scale your workflows, make building new workflows faster, but also have better performance, especially for your AI agents. And that's what I will explain in this video. So the way to recognize sub-workflows is when you see it in n8n when executed by another workflow, and this is where you will have your trigger define what is the inputs that should come to this sub-workflow to then have a sequence of nodes of actions that will be used as this sub-workflow. So it's almost like a microservice. And then you can call this sub-workflow from any other workflow where you need it. And I will be focusing on two main benefits. The first one is to use them as a reusable component in your workflows to make them more scalable, but also faster to implement because you will not have to recreate them every time you need this kind of feature. And the second one is even more interesting, and we'll spend a bit more time looking into it. To illustrate the first benefit, let's look into a real-life use case. I'll take the example of a sales ops workflow where you have, for example, a demo request enrichment flow and a workflow to enrich all the event attendees that you have in a CSV. In both cases, you will need at some point to run some lead enrichment that will, for example, leverage the email of a contact to then get information from data providers on maybe their industry, the company they work for, etc. But also have some AI, for example, summarize their company activity, score that lead, etc. To then be able here to store it in the CRM and send a Slack notification, here again to store all these leads into the CRM, etc. You could, of course, build your enrichment flow right here and add maybe 5 nodes, but then you'll also have to do it here and maybe in 10 other workflows that require this exact feature. Email as an input and maybe 5 properties as an output. And that's when you will want to use a sub-workflow. It would look like that. So the trigger will be accepting an email, and this is the place where you will be able to pass maybe the email that's in the loop. And from that email, we'll be able to use a data provider like Apollo to get a lot of information already. We'll use AI, scoring, etc., everything that you want. And at the end, we would use, for example, an edit field node because the output of the last node of your workflow, and this is very important, becomes the output of this sub-workflow as a node. So as an output, we have all the elements we need to, for example, store that contact in our CRM. So you understand here that you will be able to list the critical components that you will use in many of your workflows to actually build this kind of snippets of sub-workflow that you can reuse everywhere instead of having to rebuild the same functionality over and over again. And the most important part here is if in a couple months you will have to change, maybe add one data point to the output, you will only have to do it in that sub-workflow and it will suddenly be live for all your workflows instead of having to go to each of your workflows and maybe forget a few. So maintenance is definitely easier when you use sub-workflows in the right way. Now it's time to understand how sub-workflows can help our AI agents to be smarter. For that, we'll be looking into this use case where we have an AI agent that is supposed to answer based on a course, in this case, a biology course. So I have stored in Airtable a list of 15 chapters with chapter name, a summary, but also for each chapter, the full content, which is a lot of text. And this agent has already been quite optimized because as you can see, it has 2 tools. The first one is to search all chapters, and the second one is to get a chapter content. And if we run an execution, we'll be able to understand how it works. So again, it's a biology course, so we have actually some chapters that are related to that. And as we can see, our agent first called the tool to search all chapters and then called this tool twice. And what happens is that here we actually decided to only get the chapter ID, and summary. So we get a pretty concise output. And then we have prompted our agent, if we look into the system prompt, to first call this tool to get the summary of all chapters, and then to select 1, 2, or 3 chapters that are worth looking into. So this is already a smart practice because if we look at what the first tool call will get us, if we put that in a character counter, that would be, for example, under 400 words. So pretty efficient. And if we get, let's say, the content of 2 chapters, we will add to that in total and reach a bit below 4,000 words. Now, if our agent was always looking at the whole course, it would be 20,000 words no matter what happens. And this is of course not optimal because we are consuming a lot of input tokens, but we are also giving too much information to our agent, even though maybe only 10% of that is actually useful to answer the specific question. So this is a good first step. Now let's find ways to optimize that even further. So actually, as we see here, we have a big AI model. I have connected GPT 5.1, which is quite expensive, but also quite good. And we see that it has been called 3 times, because the first time it was called, it decided to call this tool. Then the second time it decided to call this tool, and then it had to formulate the final answer to the user. Every time there is a tool call, the whole system message that we have here, hopefully it's quite concise, but also the memory of the previous tools is always being added to the context window, and that increases the amount of input tokens that we're consuming. So ideally, we would want to only use this big model when it's really relevant. Then there is another inefficiency. This get record tool in Airtable actually doesn't allow us to filter what is being output. And we see here that we provide the chapter name or even the created time, but also the summary, even though we provide the full content. So ideally, we would just output the full content because the full content is being given. A way to solve that would be to actually remove these tools and to build a sub-workflow that actually does most of the job to go from the kind of chapters that we would need to retrieve to retrieving the full content of these chapters. And I have prepared here a sub-workflow that we can actually be using as a tool that does exactly that. We will be accepting as an input a string called topics to look for, and that would be for our agent to write the value, for example, everything related to animals. And then if we run step by step our workflow, we would then search all the course chapters similarly to our tool before. So as an output, we have the 15 chapters, their summary, chapter ID, and chapter name. Then we will clean this output by only selecting the chapter, record ID, and summary. And we are also using this opportunity to rename what we had here as the ID. We'll rename that record ID. This will be useful as we are cleaning these outputs, aggregating them all into one item here, all chapters. And then what we're doing here is we're giving all of that to an AI step, so not an agent, because we know exactly what it has to execute, and there is no need for some autonomous tool calling. There is a defined inputs and outputs. We're giving in the user message the actual inputs that we have for our sub-workflow, so here from our trigger, topics to look for. And in the system prompt, we simply say the user message will mention a topic, and you will have to find 1 to 3 relevant chapters. And we're giving here the full list of chapters and summary. So the only function of this AI step is to return, and we have the structure here, 1, 2, or 3 relevant chapter record IDs. This is why we are able to use a small AI model, because this is a fairly simple task that doesn't require a big model. So for that task, we're actually saving money and maybe accelerating the process because the model here is 4.1 minis, so it is quite cheap and way faster than GPT-5, for example. And if we run it, we'll see that it will select probably 1 or 2 chapters. Here, 2 chapters. And the output is also very optimized because it's not a lot of words, but it is enough for us to then split this output to have the 2 chapter IDs to retrieve, and then we run those record IDs through Airtable to get the full content. And this time we're able to clean the content, so we'll just return the chapter title and its full content, nothing else, before then aggregating that into our content to leverage. So here we have the full content of our 2 chapters and nothing else, and that is the output of our sub workflow. So we'll now have to add this as a tool to our agent, and it is the first option that we have. We'll give it a clear name and a clear description. We'll select the workflow canvas that contains this sub workflow, and we'll have to define the variable that we're actually listening to as the inputs of our sub workflow, the topics to look for. And for that, we will let the agent feel that, because this will be depending on the user message, so the agent is aware, and we will here click let the model define this parameter. and add a little description telling, and that should already do the job. Now we will have to change our agent system prompt to actually simplify it. You are a helpful assistant that answers based on biology course. You always start by calling the tool, and I'll replace that to get the detail. From there, you're ready to answer, only answer based on the content. Perfect. So it's even clearer for our AI agent because there is only one single tool to call, and we are now ready to test it. So our agent is calling our tool and can then provide the final answer. If we look into the tool call here, we'll see that we got 2 chapters provided by our sub workflow. And if we go in the executions to find what just happened, we have the full run of our sub workflow, and we can see that the agent just wrote animals here. We got all the courses, and then we had our AI select 2 chapters. So we were finally able to consolidate them all. And that is what our agent has actually used to write the final answer. The big improvement here is that our big AI model actually only ran twice, and for the rest, we had a very efficient AI model do the job. So from there are many ways you can optimize your AI agents, and we'll be looking at the second example here. It is an agent that has a tool that allows to run web searches through a service called LinkUp. It could be Perplexity, etc. And basically, whenever you ask a question, it has to call this tool to make a web search to then provide the final answer. The issue, if we were using LinkUp's API directly as a tool, is that all the questions would have to be asked one by one because we cannot send an array, a list of questions to LinkUp's API within one single API call. But it could be that for our agent to have enough information to answer a complex query, it would have to be allowed to run multiple queries to maybe break the topic down into multiple web searches. Another challenge is that in the LinkUp API response, you get a list of all the sources that have been used, and it's maybe not something we want to give to our agent. We just want to give the answer of that AI web search. So again, we want to make our agent more efficient and limit the input tokens to also limit the hallucination to just provide the content that it should actually be using. And to solve that, I have created a sub workflow that accepts an array of web queries. This allows our agent to be sending maybe 3 queries to the sub workflow instead of calling them one by one if it had the LinkUp API directly as a tool. Then we'll split out these queries and run them all through LinkUp before cleaning the outputs and aggregating the responses. Okay, so let's give it a try with a question that might actually require to break the topic down into sub-questions, because you might first want to define GEO, then to ask for specific challenges about 2026, and then maybe to ask for the complementarity of SEO and GEO or examples of strategies. So you want to prompt your AI agent to be able to break the topic down into multiple questions and to also have the space to list all these questions, and this is why we're using this sub workflow. Let's look into the web search tool. We can see in this parameter that it sent multiple questions. So first, the SEO trends and strategies in 2026, how to optimize geo SEO, and then best SEO practices for local and global companies. So that's the way it decided to break it down. And you could also further prompt what is the best way to break it down, maybe to define the terms first and then go more specific. The expression that I've used here is the from AI, which is the way that you allow your agent to pass a value here, because otherwise you can also send static values in the tools that your agent is calling, so the AI doesn't have control over that. And here I have called that web queries, and I have described it very comprehensively, and I gave an example of the array it is able to send, and I defined the type of value that it had to create was an array. This is a little trick, because when you use that, it is by default a string, or you might not have enough control. So I prefer to go through that and to define that it is a JSON, because you might have issues then in here to parse it. So what happened in our sub workflow is the following. We have received these 3 queries. So we were able to split them out to have 3 items, and then we ran them all in parallel to make it faster, because this API takes around 10 seconds to output. And we see here that in what it returned, there was first an answer, but then a list of all the sources. And that might be too long and not necessary for our AI to have. This is why here we are just keeping the query that we initially sent and the answer without the sources. And we then aggregate that into one nice item that our agent receives as the output of this tool call to then be able to provide the final answer to the user. So I hope these concrete examples about the ways you can leverage sub-workflows in n8n were useful. Definitely look into the ways you can really optimize your AI agents. And if you combine that with other techniques that you can have to actually break your agent down into potential path, you can reach states where you barely need agents, or so you don't have agents that have millions of tools that are not optimized, but really set up a scalable infrastructure for your workflows and your AI agents to run efficiently in a very predictable way. So you can also save time when you build workflows to scale your business.